And welcome back to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Well, welcome to another edition of the show where we basically break down all of the media malfeasance of the week. I shouldn't say all, that would be entirely impossible, but we do our best to cover the most important examples of media bias and media corruption. And one of those that I think was illustrated really well over the course of the past week was the amount of time the media focused on Ted Cruz's obvious mishap. I don't think anybody is defending what Ted Cruz did, let alone Ted Cruz, but the amount of time the media focused on that, as opposed to the amount of time the media focused on Andrew Cuomo's mishap, which is much more serious, much more extensive, comprehensive, consequential. It's much more serious by every single measure that you can possibly comprehend. Ben, what did you think about that? I'm going to put this graphic here up on the screen. So that's 54 seconds on the federal probe of Governor Cuomo. This is on ABC, and 4 times that amount on Cruz's bad optics involving his trip to Cancun last week. What does that breakdown tell you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, this perfectly illustrates the corruption of our media, its hyper politicization, the fact that it's never focused on the merits of issues, but the optics here, and the optics, of course, do not look good for a senator during a crisis to be out vacationing. On the other hand, what does it say that a media cares more about, well, this senator should be out there, working with folks in his community when that really has nothing to do ultimately with getting the power back on, and he can obviously operate remotely as everyone has been doing for months on end, versus, of course, the juxtaposition of this governor in New York was responsible, it seems, for a cover-up of epic proportions, which resulted, based on his policies, in the deaths of thousands of elderly New Yorkers. Many people never got to see their family members before they passed, to say goodbye to them, to go to their funeral. So, it's just so rich with irony and corruption. And I think ultimately what this shows also is that they feel they really need to defend Andrew Cuomo to some extent because he is fighting for his political life. On the other hand, the fact that they spend so much time on Ted Cruz means they view him, like Senator Hawley and a few others who have been really attacked quite viciously by the press in recent months, as potentially those who are going to carry the Trump mantle and his tens of millions of supporters, and they view him as a political threat. So on the one hand, they're trying to protect Andrew Cuomo. On the other hand, they're trying to destroy anyone who could potentially emerge and take on whoever the presidential candidate is on the Democrat side in 4 years. Because as I said, I think it's Kamala Harris, but we'll see what happens.
Well, and another point to that is the media's disinterest in Andrew Cuomo is also because they don't want to sort of reckon with the fact that they didn't initially cover that story as much as they should have. They didn't do the sort of like journalism, the hard, serious journalism that they needed to do when it came to Andrew Cuomo months ago. I mean, not just now, but months ago. And so to cover that story extensively now would be a concession of wrongdoing that they are not like mentally, psychologically, professionally prepared to admit. And I want to actually go back to that number that the Media Research Center calculated. That's a staggering number. 4 times the amount of coverage, 4 times the amount of coverage of a senator's trip to Cancun while his state was in crisis versus a decision that clearly led to deaths in, of proportion it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around. So to give it, it's not just twice the coverage, it's not just 3 times the coverage, 4 times the coverage. It's unbelievable. And it shows how they so easily get caught up, not just in anti-conservative stories, but also just on these trivial stories, right? Like it's fun for them to talk about Cancun. It's more exciting. It's more, they do all of this with the sort of sanctimony that they drape everything in. And so they're the defenders of our democracy from the darkness, but they also want eyeballs and they also want clicks. And that's why they're going to talk about a really glaring political error. But it's to talk about sort of the substance of Andrew Cuomo's nursing home policy. It's drier, and of course, it would involve them admitting, to not being the watchdogs that they needed to be months ago.
It's a great point. The more they cover Cuomo, the more they're in effect admitting their own failure. So that's a really excellent point. I think the other aspect of this is there's no sense of proportion in reporting. So they'll take how a person acts during one crisis, which has no discernible impact on the actual constituents, and then they will de-emphasize decisions that literally are life and death for thousands of people. And to even add another layer to it, now, because Cuomo really sort of personifies the policies that they all were essentially supporting in the ruling class, which the media is now seized for, it's particular that they can't focus on the glaring errors because it would expose the fact that policies nationwide in Democrat strongholds really followed the template and explain why New York, New Jersey, California perform so poorly versus so many other states, particularly red states like a Texas or a Florida for that matter. And the other aspect of this is less focus on Cuomo also means less focus on DeSantis in Florida, another potential figure who could be in the running for president down the road. And the little coverage there has been on DeSantis now, the angle they're trying to take is, well, he's only trying to get coronavirus vaccines in the hands of elderly in Republican neighborhoods. That's been the new narrative on DeSantis. So again, they don't want to focus on the substance, the merits of the fact that, look, why did some states perform so well when they were relatively open and other states perform so poorly when they completely shut down? They never want to answer that question. They don't actually want to deal with the science. They only want to deal with the politics, which is why when they have these taglines like facts matter, truths matter, it's so Orwellian and it's beyond parody. I mean, I tweet this out pretty much at least once a week. The Babylon Bee is more real than real life today.
Mm-hmm. It happens all of the time. And these juxtapositions are often so instructive. And Ben, we have another one to talk about actually when it comes to China. So why don't you tee up that juxtaposition, because it's just as good of an illustration as this one.
Yeah, so Jake Tapper, who slides into the DMs of every Republican and tries to act like he is an honest voice who will give a fair hearing to both sides, tweets out, of course, here, the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghurs right now. We know where, and the world is just sitting back and letting it happen. Disney even thanked local party apparatchiks for letting them film Mulan there. Well, thanks for telling us that, Jake, 3 years, 4 years more after the fact. And there's a great point by Ryan Saavedra here because he points out that in this case, the whole world is letting it happen. But when Trump is president, obviously, this is all driven by Trump. And of course, he also notes that Biden essentially creates moral relativism here in saying, well, look, they just have different norms in China in context of him, calling out to Xi Jinping all the human rights violations, but then says effectively for domestic purposes, for optics purposes, I need to be hard on you on this. But I understand that, your culture is different. It just abides genocide against minority religious groups. So here, I think the crystal clear point to be made on this is with Biden, everything is treated as in good faith. With Trump, everything is treated as in bad faith. With Biden, no problem is attributable specifically to him or his administration. With Trump, everything is specifically attributable to Trump in terms of failings, issues around the world, how they're dealt with, what the knock-on consequences are, et cetera. And I actually think this fits in well with what the Biden administration itself is trying to argue in terms of its China policy, because essentially it boils down to multilateralism and doesn't really define what that means. But if your policy is we're going to bring the world together to deal with the problem, essentially you're implicitly saying we aren't going to lead on the problem. I read it that way. And even more to the point, it means you can dither, but claim that you're working with a lot of other countries to address it so that when there are failures, everyone gets the blame, not just you. So Jake Tapper is essentially doing a better job than Jen Psaki.
Well, I mean, that's not hard to do. But there's a connection to what we talked about in the last block in that Cuomo, it's for the press to really honestly talk about Cuomo's failures is a concession of wrongdoing on their part. And I think there's something similar when we talk about Biden and China, because they're sensitive when it comes to that overlap, given that they were sort of framing it as like MAGA stupidity, that anybody would have concerns about Biden's China policy, and Biden's sort of overly friendly history with China. And so to talk about Biden and China in critical terms, it's a sensitive area for the press. It's an area in which they sort of like very deliberately walked away from, or like very deliberately paid little attention to and didn't focus much on. In fact, some of them argued against even focusing on it at all. Some of them actively argued that it was a non-issue over the course of the campaign. And so I think that's also sort of plays into this hesitance, but it's a great example of framing. So what we talked about in the last block was sort of, framing is always involved, but it's also time and focus. That's a huge area of bias. But the way that the media is now going to frame the genocide of the Uyghurs is going to be less as like a presidential issue and more as a China issue. And they'll probably actually talk about it more in general now, but they'll talk about it in these sorts of terms. And it's just such a great example of framing and how they can say, you know, when we're talking about Trump administration's policy, the president himself is directly responsible, and they'll create a negative news cycle for Trump. And again, this is beyond Trump. This is any Republican. It doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio or whomever. It doesn't matter. They'll treat them all the same way, and they would have done that before or after Donald Trump. But this is how they frame things, right? Like it's the conservatives' fault when something is going wrong. It's the system's fault when something is going wrong in a Democratic administration.
And I'll go even a step deeper here that sort of transcends the Republican Democrat binary, which is that Jake Tapper works for CNN, which is part of the whole ruling class's communications effort. And that ruling class is completely in bed with China and always whitewashes China's acts. So where was Jake Tapper when the media, including CNN, was breathlessly reporting that the numbers out of China were looking great and lockdowns in China were a perfect example of how to act, and we ought to emulate them in America? Where is Jake Tapper? Like, if you really cared about human rights like you claim to, and challenging the powerful and evil regimes and authoritarianism around the world, Communist China is the most powerful authoritarian regime around the world. It poses the greatest long-term threat to America of any regime around the world. If you care about press freedom, it is the most intent on destroying press freedom of probably any regime in the world, maybe next to North Korea. So if Jake Tapper really cared and his colleagues really cared, they could hammer Communist China every day. They could run exposés. They could do undercover investigatory reports in China. They could do a lot to undermine that regime, or even if they wouldn't call it undermine, at least expose it to the light of day, because this really is the world's evil empire of today. The fact that he only raises it now, and maybe it is to cleanse it, like we have to address this issue now because it's clear that the administration is saying it's genocide, even though State Department lawyers are kind of quibbling with that. And oh, by the way, many of the nominees are not at all getting scrutinized over their own ties to Communist China as well, which the media doesn't really want to talk about. But leave all that aside. If the Uyghur genocide is the one thing you're going to focus on, you should be hammering that home every week. And you should be challenging and bringing on the CEOs of all the companies who use labor in the Xinjiang region where this genocide is going on. And of course, it goes way beyond the Uyghurs. I mean, the press will never talk about it, but hundreds of millions of Christians are being persecuted in China. The Falun Gong have been persecuted in the most grotesque ways possible. Of course, they target any Falun Gong related publications in America, like the Epoch Times, for example. So it's just in every level. If the ruling class really cared about what it claimed it cared about, it would go at China every single day. And the fact it doesn't, and it usually is fine to either skate over it or obfuscate, demonstrates the moral bankruptcy that they show and the fakeness of woke capital, of our corporate media, of our political class and beyond, because in reality, they don't want to upset the apple cart and they want to kowtow to Communist China. I think because in their heart of hearts, many of them either have envy it, or even more broadly, they assume that China will be the dominant world power, so they better get in line, and it's in their self-interest to kowtow to them. That goes way beyond media, but the media could have a unique role to play in challenging communist China, and that they don't, and that you can only find a few tweets like these demonstrates their bankruptcy on the issue.
I think there's also just an incredible level of naivete in the media, and there's a great what's sad to me is there's a lot of really good China reporting that comes out of certain outlets every once in a while, and it's important.
Even the Times, from time to time.
The Times, BuzzFeed, and there's a fantastic frontline report on China's COVID secrets. Everybody can watch it on YouTube. I highly recommend it. But there's a moment in the documentary where they interview a New York Times reporter who is kind of reckoning with her parroting of the Chinese line, the Beijing's line at the beginning of the pandemic, where they were saying, you know, certain things to downplay the severity of the situation. And she says, I really wonder if my first report on this conditioned people to believe this wasn't as bad as it would be. She says that she honestly didn't believe that the Chinese government would be capable or have the will to orchestrate a cover-up on this level. Now, that is a New York Times reporter who covers these issues. She's at the top of her profession. And last year, when the Chinese government was, doling out line after line of nonsense that was leaving the world ill-equipped to deal with the onslaught of COVID, she was treating that with naivete. And now a year later, she's able to see that. But I do think there's an incredible amount of naivete at hand. They don't actually realize how evil the Chinese Communist Party is. It's not just sort of a different system of government. There's a real evilness at the heart of it. And I don't think that they truly understand that. I think that's sort of where a lot of this comes from.
Yeah, the last point I'd make on this, and it just enrages me, and communist China is a focus of a lot of my writing, because I do think it is the greatest external threat, but we're never even going to get to grappling with that threat if we don't pull it together at home and reinstill our own values and principles and fortify them and be Americans qua Americans. But getting off that whole bigger rant, the bottom line is that every communist regime lives on lies and deception. So if you aren't skeptical of every single thing that comes out of the regime officials and their mouthpieces, you're failing at your job. You shouldn't be in your position.
Well, speaking of people who shouldn't be in their positions and are failing at their job, that's the most beautiful segue to another thing that we want to talk about today. This is an interview in Rolling Stone. It's actually like a glowing profile of Yamiche Alcindor of PBS. And it might be sort of hard to see the quote in that image, but basically she says, the lesson of the Trump era that I hope continues is that, we don't take police at face value anymore. If the president of the United States says something, we don't just take it as reality. And it's just a stunning glimpse into how the media sees politicians who aren't Trump, sees quote unquote normal politicians, sees conservatives, sees Republicans. They have this automatic skepticism. But when it comes to people like Joe Biden, as Yamiche is admitting right here, they don't have that reflexive skepticism that used to inform journalists who covered people without fear or favor, because they just hated corrupt, powerful people. That's what we need in a fourth estate. But it's I found this interview to be, and this particular statement to be, such an incredible admission of the permissiveness that the press brings to establishment politicians. And it's so funny that it took Donald Trump for them to say, wait a second, these presidents, they might be lying to us. These cops, they might have their own interests at hand here. But the problem is, they still only are programmed to see that when it comes to Trump and when it comes to Republicans. They don't necessarily come to Joe Biden with that. But this quote was so perfect. What did you think about it?
First thing is, what are you doing in journalism if you aren't skeptical of what the authorities are telling you is the truth as they understand it in theory? I mean, you have to naturally have skepticism of those in power, because power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's a self-selecting group of people in the first place who are ambitious enough to seek power in a position, whether in law enforcement or as an elected representative or beyond, if you're working in a political position. So I think it's just laughable that basically she's saying her eyes were open because of Donald Trump. Like, what line of work are you in? And then, of course, add to this is PBS, which is, of course, at least indirectly taxpayer funded. I actually think it's the perfect representation of taxpayer funded media in that it, of course, takes the ruling class's line. It gets its funding from the ruling class, so it speaks for the ruling class. You see this even more broadly with Voice of America and the other networks that are under the federal government's umbrella. And I've written about this a couple of times over at Newsweek and how corrupted those media enterprises, which are supposed to, and obviously there's a conflict here, but are supposed to put out essentially the American government's line on a series of issues while also trying to be a neutral and fact-based arbiter of news and analysis, which is a tough thing to do, no doubt. But of course, the line they take is the leftist line on every single issue. And one of the reasons the Trump administration fought tooth and nail for over 3 years to put an appointee of its own in charge of those bureaus was precisely because the other side fought so vehemently to continue propagating the progressive internationalist line through those enterprises. So I think it even points to a deeper rot and corruption, which is that any sort of publicly funded media always ends up putting forth the prevailing public opinion in government. And that prevailing opinion is almost always progressive. Obviously, yes, you have elected representatives, and let's say we have a roughly 50-50 split. But then look at all of the bureaucrats under these agencies, and it's 90% plus Democrat in most of them. In some cases, 95+%. So look, publicly funded media figures, I guess, are going to take the public line, but don't try to act as if then you're some neutral arbiter of truth and you're actually a skeptical journalist. So again, I guess I appreciate sort of like how Twitter exposes transparently how corrupt our media class is. I appreciate here in this article the candor of Miss Alcindor, who I'm pretty sure also has literally just put out almost verbatim what the Biden administration has said on a couple of issues, like the Biden administration's talking points, without question, without any skepticism, without any hedging or anything else. She just prints it as if it's the truth. So yeah, maybe she has not learned her lesson. Clearly, I don't think she has.
She's kind of too easy of a target to pick on, almost because she's so bad at her job and has like so given up on this notion of legitimate journalism. But she doesn't realize it. Like, she's someone who does this under the banner of neutrality and objectivity, but I think is just unaware of how deep and how egregious her own bias is, because she looks at it as just, she sees the sort of like far left as mainstream and neutral. And, you know, in that way, it's a good example, but it also is sort of like, it's just almost, it's too easy with her. And, you know, at the same time, it's sad because PBS is what was behind the Frontline report I just talked about in the last block. Like, I always like genuinely feel so badly for the serious journalists that remain in the corporate press, because some of their colleagues distract from their excellent work and shift their outlets' focus away from their excellent work. But I mean, yes, this is, you know, taxpayer funded journalism from Yamiche Alcindor, and just I thought was a very stunning admission of how silly. And Rolling Stone, by the way, put this in a glowing profile of her. You know, so you have another outlet kind of framing it as the thoughts of a serious and admirable reporter. So it's just like, again, it's a really perfect illustration of everything going on. But thank you to everyone for watching. Any final thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just say one thing that I always try to keep in mind is what lane do our corporate media journalists, purported journalists, fit in? There are dupes, and this goes actually beyond even media to our politicians as well. They're sort of dupes, useful idiots, true believers, and then the people who are just ambitious and willing to do whatever it takes to rise to the top of their field. And I think we ought to keep in mind those different lanes as we go about sort of building out these different profiles or archetypes of our corrupted media class. So something to keep in mind, I think, going forward.
Something light to keep in mind. Well, you've been watching another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky. He's Ben Weingarten. Stay tuned for more episodes and make sure to subscribe.